Imprecise terminology could even create situations that make it seem like subcategories of disabled people are being suitably represented and provided for, when in fact they are not. And I am not ideologically opposed to the NCSA merely for raising these concerns. Here I've got a news article from the NCSA's own website that spells out a few of these concerns using actual statistics to back up their claims. Let's look through a section here. In an article published last month in JAMA Psychiatry, Rodgard and colleagues examined the scientific literature from 53 years, 1966 through 2019, to determine if and how the differences between ASD subjects and control, normal subjects, changed over time. The authors also examined how these changes correspond to changing definitions of ASD and the associated increases of those diagnosed with ASD. What they found was that the difference between those with and without ASD has decreased over time. In other words, what was once a homogeneous group to a heterogeneous group. This is worrisome, they said, because the growing heterogeneity may create challenges for research. Okay, that itself could be a valid point of interest. It's a tricky situation to collect accurate or consistent data on a human neurodevelopmental concept like autism, which is ever-changing directly as a result of that ongoing research into how the human brain functions. Additionally, there are humanitarian concerns regarding conducting non-life-saving invasive research such as brain scans on people who may not be able to engage with that concept and could perceive the process as traumatic in spite of the good intentions of the people performing the process. So let's read another passage, same article. In March this year, a UK study pointed to an even worse situation. Researchers from the University of Exeter and the University College London examined all high-quality autism studies worldwide in a particular year, 2016, and discovered that only 6% of participants were autistic people with a learning disability. Wow, that does sound like a serious problem and worth raising the alarm over. Speaking from my own experience growing up in the United States, I was formally diagnosed by a team of professionals and went through special education and adjacent services starting from early elementary school all the way through college. And in those special ed programs, there were all kinds of people diagnosed with difficulties that required many kinds of therapy, accommodations, or other services. And the most of these kids weren't even autistic or had Asperger's syndrome, but whether it was dysgraphia, ADHD, dyslexia, all of those, or other things entirely, all of them, all of us, had been diagnosed professionally with at least one learning disability of some kind. So even at my college, like the office that distributed services for disabled students had a chart on the wall describing the differences between former autism disorder and former Asperger's syndrome as those diagnoses were then defined, even though they still provided services to students with both of those disabilities and with neither of those diagnoses, as in spite of our wide range and diversity of leads, we had at least one or even several learning disabilities that we had to be clinically documented to require support for at that time. And that was a long time ago under old versions of the DSM. So to see research from credible British institutions like the University of Exeter and the University College of London indicating that only 6% of patients featured in worldwide autism studies were even diagnosed with a single learning disability is genuinely mind-boggling. Like when I said, I was growing up in the US in public school and later on in private college. Many of us in special education had all kinds of learning disabilities without even being diagnosed with autism. But now, 94% of the people studied in the highest quality autism research available worldwide weren't diagnosed with any learning disability? Not even one? I'm sorry, but that's bullshit.
Bullshit.
Seriously, that is some real bullshit.
That's bullshit! That's bullshit!
Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying it's bullshit data that only 6% of diagnosed autistic people are even diagnosed with an actual learning disability. I'm willing to assume that statistic is true, one way or another. What I'm saying is bullshit is that the US-based National Council on Severe Autism would present data from UK-based universities, which say that only 6% of the subjects of high-quality autism research had learning disabilities. And the reason that's bullshit is because the term learning disability literally means something different in Britain than it does in America.
That's bullshit. That's fucked up.
In the United States of America, learning disability means a wide range of clinically recognized conditions, disorders, and syndromes that would adversely impact a student's abilities to successfully function in a typical educational environment, with many people under this description being of average or above average intellectual capability. However, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, learning disability specifically describes impairments within the realm of intellectual delay. In terms of the report the NCSA is citing here, I'm taking the approach of an average reader who will read only this webpage and not do any outside research before taking away a certain impression. I don't have the report in front of me that the article is citing, so I will engage with that report based on what's presented in the NCSA's article. The article wants me to take that 6% statistic seriously one way or another, and in this case I don't think the writers intended deception of any kind. Because the report in question is based out of the UK but is observing data from across the world, I have no way of knowing if those conducting the report are using the UK definition of learning disability to apply to people in other places of the world where that term means something critically different. I would hope that autism researchers from the UK would be aware of that definition difference while collecting and presenting data globally, but based on the NCSA article, I simply don't know. Whether the 6% statistic was specifically in the context of UK-defined learning disability or not, I would also like to know whether or not the statistic was originally presented in a whistleblowing context to the effect of, oh my gosh, only 6% of researched autistic people in 2016 had this attribute. Autism research is failing to include some of the most vulnerable and effective of all autistic people. Or if they were just stating, just objectively, that the 6% statistic, just providing it as a literal description of the research populations of autistic people, and with the results being presented without any real interest in expressing a particular concern. Now, I don't have the original source handy because it was not within the article itself. That's what I'm limiting myself to. But if it was the case that the 6% statistic in the UK university report had no interest in raising any specific concern about the groups of autistic people being studied or being excluded and not studied, that would be questionable to me that the NCSA would present a statistic like that without making it clear that this concern was specific of the NCSA and wasn't mirrored by the report, but instead that the NCSA was simply using this objective third-party statistic to support their own subjective cause for concern. And they can legitimately do that. I wouldn't consider they're doing that deceptive necessarily, but this situation really does demand that level of clarity. We're talking about literal brain science here. Like, this is tantamount to talking about the income of an average worker in one decade over another, but not clarifying if the currency rates were adjusted for inflation or if the workers being compared were even in the same country. Even if the observations were sound at the end of the day, we still need to know those details to make a sensible conclusion and have a properly constructed opinion. Now, completely separate to the previous point about the study itself and ignoring the ambiguity of how it was presented and what its stats were supposed to mean by the original writers, I find it questionable that the NCSA blog presented that 6% statistic without specifying whether learning disability, without specifying that term has separate definitions in the UK, where the study was conducted, versus the US, where the NCSA is based out of. Additionally, I can't tell from the NCSA blog post whether or not the writers and editors of the post are aware that there is a difference between UK and US terminology in terms of the learning disability descriptor. Now, if the NCSA writers knew that this difference existed but still chose to fail to specify that, it could potentially flirt with intentionally misrepresenting third-party statistics in order to support their positions. Now, if it turns out that the NCSA writers of that blog post did not know that learning disability specifically meant intellectual delay in UK and not the wide range of disorders, conditions, and syndromes like it does in the US, that to me would cast doubt on their worthiness to be taken seriously in terms of discussing these issues in the first place, especially on a website that would be open to the general public of a US-based audience and not something more likely to be read only by academics who would just know these details as a matter of fact and even accessing this data to begin with. I'm not trying to micromanage the NCSA's use of technical terminology or really take cheap swipes at them for not being aware of very trivial regional differences between US and UK disability language, because like I said, this is brain science. This is something where those details do matter. Now, to make this 100% clear, I don't think the 6% statistic is false in whatever the original context of the research or data collectors were, but with the vagueness of how it's presented in the NCSA's article, I have no way of knowing if that 6% reflects a massive exclusion of an important category of people from the study, or if it just reflects the character of the autistic population in general, or if learning disability, as they deployed it, even meant a UK or US-based definition of the term. Now, to give the absolute best case scenario to the NCSA, the use of that 6% statistic as presented in the article demonstrates an absence of critical clarity that constitutes really an error that I think has the risk of misinforming the public. Now, I say this because the 6% statistic could be something that needs addressing as a unique issue of its own in terms of improving the quality of autism research going forward. But the NCSA blog post is using the 6% statistic from the UK university study on autism research in a way that could reasonably lead a US-based reader to believe that 94% of autistic people included in global autism research don't have disabilities that would prevent them from functioning normally in a typical classroom setting, which is how a US reader is going to understand that term. Now, that notion could lead US-based readers to question why people like that were given any disability diagnosis at all, let alone autism, yet receive accommodations and services in educational and workplace settings that would give non-disabled people possibly unfair advantages. And that would be really a concretely false talking point that has the potential to wind up being discussed in school board meetings or legislative sessions and actually have a direct impact on public disability policy, all while the theoretical misuse of that 6% statistic really had no intention of being malicious or detrimental towards disabled people of any description, but it so easily could be taken out of context based on its deployment on the NCSA website merely by dubbing themselves the National Council on Severe Autism. The NCSA have positioned themselves to be perceived as possessing some level of expertise on these subjects, if not actual authority. I don't know if the study done by UK universities that included that 6% figure originally intended that statistic to be used to sound an alarm over an alleged problem with perfectly functional people with arbitrary autism diagnoses sabotaging research and services for those who have extensive research-intensive inability to function normally. I don't know if that 6% figure was intended by the original report authors to imply that 94% of autistic people were merely eccentric in trivial and benign ways and shouldn't have been diagnosed, as the NCSA puts it in the description of the podcast episode I'll be analyzing and reacting to throughout future barrier aggression videos. It is my opinion, however, that whether or not the authors of the report intended those things or not, or even if the writer of the NCSA blog post intended to express that or not, that such an idea sometimes seems like something that some of the more visible personalities and friends of the NCSA either believe themselves or wouldn't mind the public believing, as it fits with certain messages and statements made by those people.